Hey guys, this is part 2 of the fondant handbag cake masterclass. So if you were watching for part 1, you saw that we built and frosted the cake and we put it into the freezer, and then my son got sick in the middle of the night, so I had to go tend to him and we stopped the class. So you might be wondering, what did I do with the cake in between last night and today? So I did not leave the cake in the freezer because you don't want to put fondant on a frozen solid cake. If your cake is completely frozen solid and then you continue to finish decorating it with fondant, as it defrosts, it's going to start to condensate in between the frosting and the fondant. That condensation is going to absorb into your fondant and make it very sticky, shiny, and any colors or things like that are going to bleed once that moisture comes through to the outside of the fondant. Let's say you have some like black candy pearls or black piping on the outside of your cake. Any color that's in those items, any food dye, is going to be pulled out with the moisture and then run down the fondant. So when I'm going to fondant my cake, I only put it in the freezer for like 15 minutes, 20 minutes on a super hot day. I just want it to be firm to the touch, but I don't want it to actually be frozen to the point where it needs to defrost. So I put this in the fridge overnight. My fridge is pretty cold, so I'm just going to pop it into the freezer while I get my fondant ready, and then it's going to be ready to put the fondant on. So it's going to go into the freezer. And for the fondant, I'm going to use some red satin ice fondant. This is just the vanilla fondant. It's gluten-free, dairy-free, nut-free, and vegan. You can get this on Amazon. I think you can get it in some of the craft stores now. I think some of them carry satin ice, but most cake supplier websites should have it as well. Question I get a lot of the time is, how do I know how much fondant I need to cover the cake? Well, I tried making a chart of like how much fondant by weight you need to cover each size round cake, but honestly it was just getting like more confusing than just like practice makes perfect. So I would just recommend just starting with more than what you think you need, and when you roll the fondant out, that's easier to know if it's going to cover the cake. So you're going to need, if you're doing a round cake, let's say you're doing an 8-inch cake and your cake is 4 inches tall, you're going to need 8 plus 8, because you're going to need to cover the circular part of the cake and then go down the sides. So you're going to need a 16-inch circle minimum to cover an 8-inch round cake. The more cakes you start to cover in fondant, the more you get a hang of knowing how much fondant you're going to need per the size of your cake. And if your fondant feels a little bit stiff, like I've had this red for a while, so it feels a little bit drier than like a very fresh, just out of the newly opened bucket. So I'm just going to take a bit of shortening, and while I'm kneading, I'll just knead that into the fondant. This is just going to help make the fondant a little bit more elasticy and smoother. The more time fondant spends out in the open air, it's going to start to dry. So you want to do each step as quickly as you can. I say kind of like rush through the beginning steps. This way you can take your time on actually applying the fondant onto the cake and smoothing it out, because that's what really matters. But does how you knead it matter? Does that matter how it looks? No, you just want to do it as quick as possible. And your fondant's done being kneaded when it's very smooth and pliable. Now, how I roll out my fondant is I start with it pretty side up. So the side where it's like all kneaded into itself, that goes down. Now I take my rolling pin and I have my cornstarch in a shaker. I want to have that nearby. I'm just checking my rolling pin, make sure there's nothing on it. Now I just roll a little bit of this top of the fondant here. I'm just making like a nice smooth starting area. Okay. Now I'm gonna lift that, put down some cornstarch. Not too much, cornstarch dries out fondant, so you just want enough that it's not gonna stick. Now I'm gonna take the nice pretty side and put that down. Now we're not gonna see that side again until we apply the fondant to the cake. So don't be flipping your fondant as you go, you're only gonna rotate it. Now if you're covering a round cake, you wanna make sure you're keeping your fondant as round as possible because it's easier to put something round onto something round, but the purse is not round, so I'm gonna need it to be a little bit more oblong. But if you were covering a round cake, you would just continue to pick up some cornstarch and rotate your fondant as you roll it out to keep it circular. Now again, you want to go as quick as you can at this stage because you don't want your fondant drying out before you even get to put it on the cake. If you need to, pick it up, put down more cornstarch. Now you want your fondant to be fairly thin. The thinner the better. Nobody wants super thick fondant on the cake, and also it covers better when it's thin. So I like to just run my hand under the fondant and make sure it all feels even. There's not like some big thick spots. This is about the thickness I've gone. You could even probably go a little bit thinner. I think I will. I always say that when it's thin enough, it almost kind of like stops rolling out more when you're doing it by hand, unless you apply like a ton of pressure. Okay, so I think that that is perfect. Now I've taken my cake out of the freezer, and I'm just going to set it to the side, and I want to roll up the fondant. I'm going to use my rolling pin and just roll it onto itself. And I'm gonna work quickly because I don't want it to crease. And I'm gonna put the cake down. And I want what was down on the mat to be what's showing. So I'm going to put the fondant over top like this. Make sure there's enough hanging off. Roll towards myself and drop it. Now it's not completely covering over here on the side, so I'm just going to move it a little bit so that it's covering the cake. Okay. Now I always start with the top and I just quickly push the fondant and get out any air bubbles. Then immediately I want to smooth the corner edge or the top edge of the fondant onto the icing, just like that. Now that it's connected to the frosting, it's not gonna crack. You know when you're fondant cake and you get cracks along the edges? This is gonna prevent it while I work on smoothing out the bottom. Now the fondant and the buttercream, they've become friends. They're stuck together. Any amount of working with the bottom, unless I was to like rip the fondant down, shouldn't cause any cracking on the edge. You don't have to worry about it being perfect, so you're gonna go back in with the fondant smoother. You just want it to be connected enough that we can work on the bottom and not worry about it cracking. Now, the first mistake is people will start to smooth like this, downwards. That's not what you wanna do. We don't wanna pull the fondant down. We wanna start at the bottom, push up. Start at the bottom, push up. If you feel any air bubbles, work those down towards the bottom, but only once the fondant is onto the icing. You never want to push down when the fondant isn't stuck. Now, when you get to a place where there's a big fold like this, you're gonna, from the bottom, open it like a book. So it's nice and fat now, it's not like a tight ripple. And then again, from the bottom, push towards the cake, open it more if you need to. And push it onto the cake. So big crease, open it, start at the bottom, push up, get rid of any air bubbles, crease, open from the bottom, push onto the cake. Now don't try to work, if you're standing here, don't try to work on this part like this where you can't really see what's going on. Just put your fingers on the cake board and turn the cake so you can see what you're doing. Or if you're like on a kitchen island like I am, you can just walk around to the other side. Now you might think in this situation, let's smooth everything else and then worry about this big crease because it's scary. Don't do that. Start with the crease first. Now, final crease is always where people get messed up and they end up like pushing it together and like cutting it and making a seam. We're not gonna do that. We're not gonna let the cake scare us. We're gonna do just what we've been doing. Open it at the bottom. And if the fondant comes off where you've already pushed it down as you're opening a crease, that's okay. Now start at the bottom, 2 hands if you need, if it's a big opening, and we're just gonna push, open, push, open, push, open, push. Okay? Now we have it all on the cake. Now before I worry about smoothing the fondant, first I want to remove this extra because it's going to get in the way, it's going to dry out while it's sitting here, we don't want to waste it. So I'm going to take the fondant smoother with the rounded edge. I'm just going to do the bottom crease of the cake. I'm going to push just one time around until I've made a little track for myself. I can't zoom in, but hopefully you can see it. And now that I've got the track, I'm going to keep rubbing. I'm not rubbing on the cake yet. I'm just pushing down on the board and the fondant. And basically what I'm going to do is push it so it's so thin that I can actually see the board. If you leave the fondant thick on the edge, then when you go to cut it, you're going to have a thick border around the bottom of your cake, and you're going to need to apply some kind of a border. But when we're doing a handbag, handbags don't have borders, so we don't want to have to put like any kind of frosting or ribbon around it. So I want a really clean edge when I cut it. Okay, now so it's very thin along the edge of the cake. I can see the board through. Now I'm going to take my cutter, holding it straight up, but making sure that any like parts of the cutter don't scrape the cake. I'm going to go around the bottom edge of the cake. Now I'm going to pull the fondant away. And if you have any stuck to the board, that's okay. Take out any big pieces, but worry about the little bits later. Get this kneaded back up and in the bucket so it doesn't go bad. Okay, now I like to do the next step on my turntable. So I'm just going to put the turntable down and the cake on top of it. Okay, now we want our fondant smoothing tool. And you can kind of just like scrape away that fondant there. Usually it'll just come right off with your finger, but if you need to use a little spatula or palette knife, you can. Just be careful not to damage the fondant that's on the cake. Okay, so same process. I want to start with the top as I did before. The reason we start with the top is because if we encounter any air bubbles, we're going to be able to get them out. But if we start with the bottom and work our way up, all we're going to do is seal those air bubbles into the top of the cake. We don't want to do that. And around like the rounded edges, you can use your hand. Now I can see there's an air bubble here. You can see that bump. So I'm just going to take the side of my hand and work that down. So you can see it here. Now I push it down towards the bottom and it escaped out the bottom seam. And if you end up with like a little bit of extra fondant there, we can cut that off at the end after we've done our smoothing. We'll need to do like another little trim. Sometimes your air bubble will kind of like split off into two like that one just did. So make sure you just feel around, see if it has a little baby that it let out. Another one on this side. Okay, I think that's it for major air bubbles. So now I'm going to take my smoother and go right up against the side of the cake on the same angle that it is. And if you want to work with your smoother this way, you can, or you can do it this way, whatever you prefer. If you feel your cake getting a little bit sticky because it's humid, maybe where you are, like it is here, it's August in New Jersey, so it's very humid, just put a little cornstarch on your smoother. We'll worry about getting the cornstarch off the cake later. So now I'm just going around the cake. Going to trim off any of that extra fondant that pushed down. so at this stage, I think it's good. I don't see any more air bubbles. It's smooth to the point of where I like it for this next step. And so I'm just gonna go along my bottom edge again, just pushing down to see if there's any fondant that, as I was smoothing the fondant, it kind of like built up towards the bottom and needs another trimming, because like I said, I won't be putting a border on this cake. So, and there is some fondant that has kind of like grown like a chia pet at the bottom. So we're gonna trim that again, holding it straight up and just going along the edge. And it's a very like small amount, so I'm not gonna be able to get it with my hand. So I just want to grab like a little picker tool and remove that. Okay, so the next step before the fondant gets hard and starts to crack if you touch it, we want to put our pattern onto the base of the cake. So we're going to be using this stitching tool. Like I said in part one, I don't know where I got it, it's really old, but if you just look up like a fondant quilting tool, you should be able to find it. I know that I think it's Evil Cake Genius has them. I just don't know if it's this exact one. Now the important thing when using something like this is to make sure that you're holding it straight, because you want to make sure that your pattern doesn't start to like drift off in one direction. So usually I would sit at like my kitchen table so I could be eye level with it, but what I'll do is I'll just kneel down so that the cake is eye level to me. And you don't want to go and start in the middle of the cake, because you want like the pattern to line up, or where it doesn't line up, you want that to be the back. So I'm just going to choose the front of my cake, which I think this is going to be the front. So I'm going to start at like the back corner. Okay, so what I'm doing is just impressioning the tool into the fondant, and I'm going to do that all the way around. Okay, now that I've gone all the way around the cake, and you'll see it didn't go all the way to the top, but that's okay because there's going to be the top part of the purse, which we're adding later. I'm going to take my stitching tool, and I'm just going to go on the outside of the line. So I'll show you, there'll be like 2 stitch lines that go on each one of these lines. So just like that, I'm running like a double stitch along all of these lines. So I will do that and we will get back. Okay, so I've gone ahead and done the stitching pattern all around the cake, and now I'm going to set it aside. And I'm going to grab a small rolling pin because I want to do the top flap of the purse. So I'm going to go ahead and get out some more red. Just going to roll that out. don't know how big you need the top flap to be, you'll just need to measure how wide you need it to be across and how long you need it to be. You could also make like a template for it with some parchment paper. I'm going to use my little template from before to just know how wide across I need it to be. Let's go ahead and make a template just so I can show you guys how I would do that. So just take a piece of parchment paper, place it on the cake, and grab a marker first. So I've just got something that will write on the parchment paper, and I'm just going to hold the parchment where I would be attaching it in the back. And so I want to know for the front, I'm going to want it to come down to about here. And I'm going to want it to come down on like a little bit of a curve. So just going to kind of like roughly mark up one side. Okay, like that. Now I'm going to fold this in half. Make sure it's even on the top. Okay, so it's even. I'm going to cut it. I'm also going to trim just a little bit. On the sides because it was hanging over just a smidge. And I'm going to test it before I put the fondant. Just make sure. Good. Okay, so now I'm going to put it back onto the fondant that I have here. And just go around and cut it out. Okay, now again, what's on the mat is going to be my top side. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it. Don't worry about the cornstarch. And I'm going to use my tool and do the impressioning now, working quickly, because it's just going to be so much easier than trying to do it on the cake. Don't push too hard. You don't want to go all the way through and cut out little triangles. Just one impression. And now the tool is not long enough to get down here, so I'm going to just line it up. Okay, go ahead with the stitching as well. If you're having a hard time getting your stitching straight, you can also just work diamond by diamond instead of trying to do like long lines that you need to keep straight. I usually put like one finger down on the cake and use that as a guide. It just helps keeps my hand going in the straight direction. Okay, stitching's all on. If your cake is sticky, then you don't need to put anything down. My air conditioning was just running, so I'm going to hit it with a little water. And you can put a little bit of your water on the back side of this as well. You can use piping gel if you have that instead of water. That's definitely my preference. I'm out of gel right now. Now I'm going to line up the back first. Then I want to make sure my top is even. And then I'm going to drop down my flap. You can see my fondant was wet on the back, so the dye is on my hand now. Okay, now my flap's on. Do my edges down. Make sure my edges don't look jagged since they were cut. Sorry, I just realized you guys have been crooked. Okay. Now, you can take your stitching tool and do the perimeter. You could also have done that before you put it on. I think I'm going to do the perimeter in the different side of the tool, and we'll see how that looks. I'll start in the back. Oh yeah, I like that. Okay, so okay, and you can use this tool to put a seam anywhere you like. I'm gonna put one here. Here. Just at like the top of where my pattern ends. You could go down the center on the side. Like so. Okay, so now our handbag needs a strap. And I'm going for like kind of like a crossbody look, so I'm going to do a bit of a longer strap. Okay. Set this aside. Okay. Should we do black or a red strap? Let's see. No, let's do red. Okay, so let's roll out the red. We need to roll it out into a long strand. I'm not going to do it like all in one piece. I'm going to try to do 2 smaller pieces. So I'm going to roll out kind of like a wide rectangle. Let me go check on him. Be right back. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we're just rolling out a long piece. Roll it out to be as long as you need it for about half. So you're going to do 2. Keep in mind how much space you have on your board for a strap. Okay, now use a ruler or a strip cutting tool if you have one. I don't know where mine is, so we're gonna just eyeball it. And I'm gonna cut 2 even sized straps. And I'm gonna cut them twice as thick as I need because I'm gonna fold them in half. So let me show you what I mean. Okay, so I'm going about 1.5 inches thick. And I'm going to cut a duplicate of that. Okay, so I have my 2 strips. away. So I want to fold them in half. This is going to be my side that's facing up, so I'm going to fold it here, just edge to edge. That. Press it down. Fold your next one and then go back to that one. Worry about fixing like any little boo-boos you need to fix. Because you don't want this one to dry out and crack in the meantime. Okay, so it's folded edge to edge. Now I can push it down. I'm going to take some water and just brush it in between the two so they stick together. Now I want to stitch the edge. So I've gone once down with the thicker side of the tool, and now I'm going to just go right next to that line with the thinner side. Just making it look like the straps have a nice pattern of stitching on them. Okay, I'm going to attach them. Kind of just see how I want them. Some water down here. Start same way on this side. Oops. the two to meet, of course. And I'm just trying to make the strap fall in like a realistic way. I've glued the two ends together because I want it to look like a belt. And I'm just going to add stitching to the back side of this strap because you see the back here. You don't see the back anywhere else, so I'm just going to put the pattern here too. Just going to go in with my X-Acto knife and clean up the edge so it has like a nice sharp edge. And I'm going to use my poker tool to make the holes. You could also put a little stitching on the edge to make it look finished. And you can do that here as well. So it looks sewn onto your bag. You can add like a few rows of stitching, or you can cover this with like a gold accessory. Okay, let me grab some white fondant. Okay, you know what guys, instead of white, let's do it in the red. This is a good technique if you're not too confident on your skills of painting like the gold or silver luster dust onto the cake. If you do it in white, you really need to completely cover the white, you know, or you're gonna see it. But if you do it in the same color as your cake, then you don't have to worry about getting the edges because they won't stand out. Okay, so I just want to roll out a little bit of red to cut some accessories. Drawing a blank on what what does a belt look like? Okay, now I want to roll a little snake. let's put some more like little tiny details around. We'll paint them. We'll get rid of the cornstarch on the cake. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think we work pretty hard, and I think we deserve a Chanel handbag. So let's make this a Chanel. Okay, so I'm gonna use a little bit bigger circle for the exterior. And something bigger for the middle so that they're thinner. They shouldn't be so thick. Now I'll cut them into a C. Okay. All right, now let's mix up some gold. Okay, I've got some vodka, some Super Gold luster dust. Now we need something to mix it in. I've got these little paint trays. I get these from the Dollar Tree. I put my vodka in one and then the dust in the next. Make sure you grab an appropriate size paintbrush. You don't want to use like a huge paintbrush for little small details. And then I just start to mix in some of the vodka with the gold. Since I'm painting over red and not white, I want it to be like a little thick. So I'm just making like a paste along the edge here. So there's still powder here, but here is what I'm going to use. Okay, so since we're painting over the red and not white, I usually let it dry, my first coat, and then I just go ahead over again with a second coat. Just if it's like streaky or you can see any red through it, I just like lightly go back over. if you get any paint onto the red fondant where it's not supposed to be, just get a clean paintbrush and damp it with a little bit of water. Make sure it's not like soaking wet where it's gonna run, so I dip it in water and then I blot it onto a towel, and then I just wipe away. And in between each wipe, clean your paintbrush really well, or you're just gonna keep putting the gold back. So here is a close-up of the cake. You can see there's still some cornstarch. Now, some people say that if you just put it in the fridge will like melt off the cornstarch. In my experience, that's not always the case, and you know, I think refrigerators go through like stages. Honestly, mine does. Sometimes it's more like wet and humid in there. Sometimes it's like bone dry. So go ahead and get a steamer if you don't already have one. I'm just using like a regular closed steamer, and I just lightly and quickly go over the fondant. Don't hold it in one spot, just do quick swipes, and always hold the handle straight so the steam is going out like this. Don't tip it down because water can spit out. So if the cornstarch doesn't come off right away, you're just going to keep going back to it, but you don't want to hold the steam on. The top can be a little tricky, so I'm still just holding the handle straight. I don't want to point it down to try and get the top. So you can see the fondant gets nice and shiny. It looks just like real leather. Don't overdo it. Don't want it to start running. I'm gonna set it up and get some good video angles for you guys and some good lighting. So I noticed a little bit of gold there on the red where it's not supposed to be. Now just watch how easy it is to remove it. I'm gonna use the back of my paintbrush, and the cake is still wet from being steamed. I'm literally just gonna lightly scrape it, and it's gonna come right off. Alright, so here's the finished cake, and just my handbag for like size reference, so you can see shape reference. Slightly different bag obviously, but okay guys, so I'm going to upload this. If you have any questions about anything I did, please don't hesitate to comment, message me on Facebook, let Christy know. We can even hop on a live and answer the questions. I hope you guys enjoyed the video.